You're listening to the Future Sense podcast. You can find us online at futuresense.it. Hi, welcome to episode 144 of Future Sense. I'm your host, Steve McDonald. And if you're new to the podcast, we have been tracking the evolution of humanity beyond the end of the scientific industrial era and focusing particularly on human consciousness and using as a reference a body of research by Dr. Clare W. Graves, who lived last century and passed away in 1986. He left us with a developmental psychology model that maps out 8 stages or layers of human value systems and associated behaviours and explains how our consciousness adapts to the increasing complexity of our life conditions. For a detailed description of those layers, then please check back to episode 1 of Future Sense, which covers the first tier of human consciousness from layers 1 to 6, and then episodes 12 and 22 look at the second tier of consciousness, particularly layers 7 and 8. You can also look at the resources page on the Future Sense website, which is www.futuresense.it. And there you'll find some information about the layers and stages, the change process, and a link to a book called The Change Code, written by Monica Bourgeot from Canada. And I wrote the foreword to the book. And that's a great introduction to Clare Graves' model too, if you want to dive in a bit deeper. Well, it's great to be back on air after a long break of just over 2 years. I've been away on a pilgrimage to Gurrin country in Queensland, exploring my Indigenous roots, which has been a very rich experience, and it's also kept me pretty busy for the last couple of years helping out with the community and governance issues up there. I've just recently relocated to Byron Bay in New South Wales, back on Bunch Island country, and it's great to be back. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the state of the shift globally. Where are we at in terms of value system development and also regression back through the old value systems as part of the change process. And then I'm going to introduce some new information that's come to me this year, which looks at Planetary Ascension. So this is a body of work that's been channeled over the last 50 some years. It's an incredible mixture of narrative of human evolution and advanced science about the ascension process. And it fits very, very well with Graves' model because it basically picks up from the end of second tier consciousness and takes us into the future. So where are we at right now? Part of Graves' developmental model is what's called the cycle of change, which is basically a map which shows the human experience as we begin and progress through the change process and come out the other end of it. And there's an image which shows the cycle on the Future Sense website. If you want to go to the resources page and just scroll down, you'll see the cycle of change there as I talk about it. Essentially, there are 2 pathways through the change process. One is called evolutionary change, and the other is called revolutionary change. And it's named revolutionary because it involves a process of getting stuck and then breaking through, like a revolution, breaking through the barriers and coming out the other side. And the evolutionary pathway is a process that includes small steps along the way rather than any sudden, sharp movements during the evolutionary process. Lots of small changes as opposed to a very big change. But the evolutionary path requires an extraordinary amount of awareness, and therefore it's not very common in the world currently. Because in order to tread the evolutionary path of change, you really need to have the awareness that as soon as things seem slightly unstable or stressful, there is change going on, and then you need to take proactive steps to work with what's changing in order to navigate the path. I guess it's fair to say that the evolutionary change path is more likely to be used by someone operating and living from second-tier consciousness than someone from first-tier consciousness. Now, the revolutionary path leads us into a place of stress once we lose that stability, and then it begins a process of trying to figure out what's wrong, looking for solutions, and that search for solutions takes us back through older value systems as we say, okay, the way I'm living at the moment is not working. What if I go back to the way things used to be some time ago. And usually that regression can take you further back than the value system that you're currently moving out of. So it can be quite a deep search into the past, looking for some way of living that's going to solve the problems that you seem to be facing. And of course, when we apply older and less complex ways of thinking to trying to solve more complex problems in our present, inevitably it fails and we descend into a place of chaos where it feels like everything's falling apart. And under the pressure of that chaos, that's when we start to experience changes, usually that we're unconscious of, such as brain chemistry and those sorts of things, which bring insights and eventually allow us to break through the barriers which are holding us back. And that takes us out of the chaos zone and then into a renewal process, which is where we learn to live according to the new insights and we renew our life and eventually come to new stability again. So at the moment, much of the world is going through that chaotic phase on the revolutionary change path, facing barriers, getting stuck, and regressing to older value systems, particularly layer 4, authoritarian ways, and even further back now to layer 3, where we're seeing the expression of raw power from a mindset that has no compassion and no regard for other people's lives or rights. And that is essentially a heartless approach. And when I first came upon Graves' model and started to understand this change process, it really didn't make sense to me why we would go backwards like that. And eventually the penny dropped and I realized that it's essentially to create tension. So this is something that's evolved to speed up our evolution when we face these kinds of barriers and need to change. And by going backwards, we create tension, much like pulling a slingshot backwards to create tension on the elastic band. And then that energy that comes from the tension is used to propel us forward into what's next. So the regressive search always leads us to realizations that the old ways are not what we need. And the search puts us under sufficient pressure that we can go through a process of rewiring our brains and renewing our brain chemistry to allow for new thinking and new insights to come through, and then we progress. The big questions are, how long is this regression going to go on, and how far are we going to regress? What needs to happen in order to create enough energy for us to move beyond this kind of behavior as a species? My go-to predictive tool is Martin Armstrong's economic confidence model, which is a computer-based predictive algorithm that I've found quite accurate over the years, and partially because it's aligned with solar cycles, which drive human behavior. And it's indicating that the old world, in other words, those who are still living in the energy of the old paradigm, the old consciousness, will continue to go through an authoritarian period marked by civil unrest, till about 2029, 2030, and then we're looking at a major turning point in 2032. It's important to understand that not everybody is going to be experiencing this and that we are effectively splitting into two worlds at the moment. It's been underway for a while, a bifurcation process of two paths, and Martin Armstrong's algorithm is designed on the patterns of the old world, and therefore it's useful for predicting the behavior of the old world. And so those parts of the planet and those people that are still immersed in the old consciousness will continue to experience those things as his algorithm is predicting. However, those who are moving into and holding the new consciousness are actually on a different pathway now. You could call it a different timeline. And we're really in a space where there are effectively two clear dimensions to the world, the old and the new. And they're still very visible to each other, but they are really two separate timelines. So take heart in that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the show, but effectively it comes down to what you're focusing on, you are creating. Let's have a look now at the emergence of layer 6, which is the value system just beyond the scientific industrial, which has been emerging most notably since the 1960s and slowly bumping heads with and gradually overtaking the scientific industrial mindset, layer 5. So layer 6 is postmodern, relativistic, It is driven by deep human connection, which is very, very different to the driver of the old layer 5 paradigm, which was personal success. And we're seeing layer 6 at scale now globally in a way that Clare Graves never saw it. Back in his day, layer 5 was the dominant system globally. So layer 6 is a communal system, bearing in mind that as we progress through the layers, they alternate between individual focus and communal focus. So we've come out of the individually oriented layer 5 era and we're into the communal layer 6 era. It's network-centric. It absolutely prefers a level playing field, so it will break down hierarchies, sometimes in an obsessive way that creates problems. It absolutely shuns physical violence. It's very ecologically minded, and being a communal system, conformity is very, very important. So whereas with layer 4, the previous communal system, the standards of the community were usually drawn from a higher authority and often a god within a religious setting. Now, in layer 6, the standards are set by your preferred network. So in order to remain within your preferred network and accepted by your network, you must conform to whatever those standards are. The shadow aspect of layer 6 is egocentric, and each one of the layers has a shadow aspect, and it equates to the attributes of the system 3 down. So layer 6 shadow aspects are related to the behavior of layer 3. And in this case, it's egocentricity and power orientation. Not power in a physical sense, but power in the sense of being an influencer and having the power to accept or shun membership of that preferred network. Which, when your main motivation is deep human connection, then that can be a pretty hard hit emotionally. So conformity is very important. Networks tend to isolate themselves from people who are not like us, even though the expressed attitude is one of acceptance and love and community. There is a boundary around that. It only goes so far. So if somebody is not conforming with your standards, then that's where the love stops, essentially. And this is sometimes called cancel culture. Now, there's something called the pre-trans fallacy, which is a term coined by Ken Wilber to describe a strange anomaly that comes up around people who are living through the layer 6 value system. And right now, the term being used globally for this is the woke mind virus. And what it means is, in the transition from layer 5 through layer 6 to the second tier breakthrough, we go through a process of reorienting our inner compass. So previously in layer 5, the rational mind was king, and everything was about rationality, about logic, about strategy, and that's how we worked out what was good for us and which way to go in life. Now, in preparation for second tier, while we're in layer 6, we need to let go of that dominance of the rational mind, because ultimately in second tier, the heart is going to be the king. And the heart is going to be our main guidance system. So that reorientation process requires us to quieten the mind, quieten that rational part of ourselves, to engage with our emotions, to open our heart, and to learn to discern between what we feel internally that's giving us guidance messages. And that can be fear, or it can be an intuition or an instinct. And living through layer 6, we've got to learn the difference between those things. As you can imagine, that process of giving up our main guidance system, which is the rational mind, and then learning to fly a completely new system where we have to understand how not to act out of fear and understand how to tap into our higher intuition. And to follow that, it creates a time of confusion. There is a confusion zone that we've got to get through within layer 6. And that's what Ken Wilber called the pre-trans fallacy. And he called it that because he observed people who were thinking and acting illogically because they were deep in this reorientation process. And as I said before, this process is in preparation for the breakthrough into second tier consciousness. And part of that breakthrough into second tier consciousness involves a polarity shift between the head brain and the heart brain. So whereas prior to the shift, our brain is masculine orientation and the heart is feminine orientation, as we shift into second tier consciousness, at some stage there will be a polarity shift where the head brain becomes feminine, the heart brain becomes masculine, and the heart brain becomes the dominant compass and the dominant guidance system for our way of being. So when you're looking at the world and the news about the woke mind virus, understand that many of these people are going through that reorientation process. They may have lost their moral compass and are in the process of moving away from rationality, away from the dominance of the rational mind, but haven't yet really bedded down their new guidance system. In my opinion, one of the most important things in order to navigate that process successfully is staying grounded. I mean literally earthing yourself. Getting outdoors, connecting with the earth, walking on the earth barefoot, and staying in tune with the earth's frequency, which at the moment is shifting reasonably quickly. You think about what people are occupied by these days, sitting in front of screens, being affected by the frequency of those devices, and not necessarily getting outside enough and getting sunlight and earthing. Therein is where the problem arises. Allow yourself to stay in tune with the frequency of the earth. I am coming across more people operating from layer 7 second tier in my day-to-day life, and that's very, very encouraging. When we look out at the world, generally, it's difficult to point out people who are operating from second tier simply because they are so adaptive and they will adapt to whatever environment they're in and meet people where they're at. So unless you're having close contact with somebody and the opportunity to have a discussion with them, it can be tricky to pick. So yeah, it's not so easy to point around at the world and say, here are second tier things happening. But let's check in on the attributes of layer 7 just for those new listeners and to remind our old listeners. So one of the first and most significant things that happens as we pop into second tier, layer 7, is that fear drops away. And it doesn't mean that we stop feeling fear at all. It simply means that it's no longer a driver of our behavior, and that's a very significant thing. We also experience an increase of our interdimensional awareness, and with that comes the capacity to detect and read the frequency of the value systems in other people. So all of a sudden, we look around and we realize that, wow, all these people around me, they're all operating on these different frequencies, and they're not aware of it, but I am. And that's a very interesting place to be. We also settle into a new way of knowing. And we spoke earlier about layer 5 and the dominance of the rational mind and the process of knowing according to logic and reason. And then that transition that begins to take place in layer 6 and eventually settles down as we move into layer 7 to what's technically termed transrational intelligence. In other words, beyond rationality. And it is a way of direct knowing, and it's very much an aspect of heart intelligence. And that's a process. It's not something that just happens instantly, but it's something that will gradually develop and that we have to learn to work with like any other process. And these things combined bring us to a massively increased coping capacity. And this is why Dr. Graves in his research called this level, layer 7 in second tier, a momentous leap in human consciousness. And when you look around at what we see developing in the world today as the scientific industrial world collapses, you can start to get an idea of why second tier intelligence becomes important and is becoming important for humanity to survive and rebuild a broken world. And remember that there's a correspondence between the first tier layers and the second tier layers in that they're like a higher octave. So layer 7, 8, 9 in second tier reflect the themes of layer 1, 2 and 3 in first tier, and layer 1 essentially being a basic survival theme locally, but layer 7 being more about planetary survival and species survival. Layer 2 being tribal at a local level, and layer 8 being tribal mindset at a planetary level. And then layer 3 being the first realization of self. So the first time that we have a clear understanding of our identity as an individual. And then layer 9, I must just add that Graves did not document layer 9 in his research. So this is something that's been added later to his work based on human observation and the work of a lot of pretty intelligent people, including Ken Wilber at his best. And layer 9 in second tier, that second octave of the realization of self, I'm coming to understand represents a realization of the holographic self. In other words, an opening to the process that we are capable of in terms of projecting our creation into the collective hologram. And that's something that I'll talk more about and unpack in later episodes. All right, let's talk about Planetary Ascension. Earlier this year, I was pondering returning to the Future Sense podcast, and I put a question out to the cosmos. Okay, what's next? And not long after that, I came across a most remarkable website called newearthstar.org, which has been created by a lady from the US called Christine Nartumid. And Maya is a channeler and an interpreter of the Akashic Records. And she has been channeling the soul who incarnated as Thoth or Thoth in ancient Egypt and has accumulated over 50 years worth of information and advice and advanced science. And it's the most extraordinary collection that I've ever come across in my life, without exaggeration. I dove into her material and spent a lot of time going through the video collection that she has, and have reached out to her and made contact with her, and Maya has agreed to come on the podcast. So probably our next episode will be me interviewing Maya, so look forward to that. And what I'm going to give you now is really a teaser, just a few headlines, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because I still don't know enough about the material, and it's going to make a lot more sense to have a deeper discussion about this with Maya on board. What I'm seeing is that at the tail end of second tier, so after layer 9, we're looking at an ascension process, which is a full light body activation process. I kind of already knew that, but this is confirmed in the New Earth Star material. And I also was aware of the possibility that there could be some kind of a trigger event, so an intense event that accelerated the evolutionary process, the ascension process for the planet and for humanity. And I've spoken on previous episodes about our solar system's transit of a null zone, an electromagnetic null zone, as we move between the local cloud and the G cloud. And in the process, our planet will be exposed to intense cosmic energy waves affecting our biology and the planet. And for those souls who are ready to make the dimensional shift to the fifth dimension, it would be a trigger for that event. And I've come across this information in a number of different sources, and it's generally called the Alpha and Omega return, or the Alpha and Omega event, an ascension trigger event. And much of the New Earth Star material is focused on this event, and the whole purpose of the New Earth Star website really is to help us understand our history, how we came to be here, this process that we're going through at the moment, what's to come in terms of the ascension event, what to expect after the ascension event, and a whole lot of science to explain the detail. It's interesting to note that Maya's material is saying that the shift has already begun, and we're in a phase at the moment which Thoth has called Pyramidus Radius, and I'm definitely feeling that the energy has shifted over the last few years, so that fits well with me. And it's also saying that some pathfinders who are here for that purpose will achieve full light body activation earlier than the trigger event. And during this Pyramidus Radius preparation period, people will be called to gather in certain zones on the planet to receive education and support ahead of the LP40 event, and also through the LP40 event, which is not a split second, but it's a process, an extended process. And it's clear that there will be time after the LP40 event is triggered for people to be lifted up in frequency by those who are here to assist that process. So it doesn't seem clear-cut at all that you need to be at a certain level of development in order to achieve ascension through the trigger event. It seems that there'll be a spectrum of availability, and as long as your heart frequency is within that spectrum, then given the right support, you may well be taken through an accelerated process of development very, very quickly in order to be able to ascend, which is very reassuring. And ultimately, the choice to ascend is something that we make at soul level. And if your soul has chosen to ascend at this time, then there is no doubt that you will be in the right place at the right time, and you will receive everything that you need in order to complete that ascension. There's no indication in the New Earth Star material of how soon the LP40 event may happen. There are lots of sources pointing to 2032 as a major turning point in our evolutionary process. And Prion, through Lee Carroll, has stated that stability will return to the planet by around 2038. So there's a window of possibility there. What we do know for sure is that we are currently in the preparation period. I'm looking forward to having an in-depth discussion with Maya about her website and the Thoth material and 50-something years of channeling on the next episode of Future Sense. Check out our website, newearthstar.org, and I hope you'll join us. I'm Steve McDonald. Thanks for listening to Future Sense. You've been listening to the Future Sense podcast, brought to you by the non-profit Agency for Advanced Development of Integrative Intelligence, part of the RD Mesh Foundation. You can find us online at futuresense.it, where you can subscribe for free, and also link to our social media accounts on Twitter and Facebook.